these are aspects of positive jealousy in Arabic that are not included under hasad whatsoever. Because hasad has a negative implication, has a negative connotation. And specifically, it stems from a person hating to see any other human being in a situation in which they are superior or better than them in some regard. This is what is at the root. Ibn Rajab makes this comment, rahimahullah. He says, at the root of this is a person is not comfortable seeing someone else in a state of accomplishment or a state that's better than them, right? And then what that leads to in terms of hasad, right? And hasad is not just a passive emotion, right? Our thoughts, can ultimately impact not only our actions, but can also have a direct negative impact on another person. Even if we don't take a material or a physical motion towards them, this can harm the other person. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَمِن شَرِّ حَاسِدٍ إِذَا حَسَدَ. And from the harm of the hasid, the one performing the hasid, when they commit this envy, right? So a person that harbors envy, harbors hasad, ultimately their tongue is going to drip poison, or their hand is going to strike, or they're going to do something wrong. But before and without doing any of that, they can still cause harm by the hasad, by just that emotion which can create a response and a harm with the other person. Also, al-hasad specifically, when we move from the comment of Ibn Rajab of it stemming from having an issue with somebody else being in a good situation or having a bounty, al-hasad now is when that bridges into disliking some ni'mah, right? Some bounty, some blessing that another person has, and wishing that the other person would lose that ni'mah, that blessing, right? Now that could be many things. And hasad can be very sneaky, right? It does not have to be, premeditated, in the sense that if a person is not guarding their heart, it's easy for hasad to sneak in, right? So if a person has been, seeking marriage for some time, or having some of the ups and downs of life in the household, right? And they're not being very self-aware of their heart and their state, then hasad can creep in without premeditation for evil, because again, I see an Instagram version of somebody else's life, right? You see a person in the moment of the engagement or the wedding, or you see a couple walking in the park and you don't know that they, had a difficult whatever that came before. You're seeing an Instagram snapshot of that person, so hasad kind of sneaks in very easily. Interestingly, the Prophet ﷺ started the hadith about brotherhood and sisterhood with the evil of hasad, which is rather surprising. It's rather surprising. The hadith talks about financial transactions, talks about cheating, talks about hate, but the hadith started with what? With hasad, with envy, right, or jealousy. But the ulama, they make a very interesting comment. What is the first transgression in the kind of history of humanity? What's the first sin, the root of the first sin that happened in the heavens? Al-hasad, by whom? By shaitan, right? This was the root that took Iblis, who would become the shaitan or the Satan, from being such an exemplified servant that was worshipping at such a high level, such distinguished company among the angels, to the lowest of the low. Where did it start? What catalyzed it? It was this envy. The story comes many times in the Quran al-Kareem, but each time we get a slightly different lens and a complementary view. One of the passages, the surah comes in Al-Baqarah and Al-A'raf and Al-Hijr and Taha and elsewhere. So particularly the account of Surah Al-A'raf gives us a view into the impact of al-hasad upon al-shaytan. So Surah Al-A'raf, chapter number 7, verse number 12. قال ما منعك ألا تسجد إذ أمرت قال أنا خير منه خلقتني من نار وخلقته من طين. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, what kept you from prostrating when I ordered you? He said, I am better than him. You created me from fire, and you created him from clay. So in fact, the first transgression in the heavens was this transgression of al-hasad, right, which led to arrogance and obstinance and ultimately to the downfall of the shaitan. What was one of the first transgressions on earth? The envy of that occurred between the sons of Adam. This comes in Surah Al-Ma'idah, chapter number 5, verses 27 to 30. وَاتْلُ عَلَيْهِمْ نَبَأَ بْنِي آدَمَ بِالْحَقِّ إِذْ قَرَّبَا قُرْبَانًا فَتُقُبِّلَ مِنْ أَحَدِهِمَا وَلَمْ يُتَقَبَّلْ مِنَ الْآخَرِ, till the end of the verses. That relate to them the story of the two sons of Adam, right? Cain and Abel, or Qabil and Habil. When each of them offered a sacrifice to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it was accepted from one but not from the other, he said, I will kill you. The former said, Allah accepts only from those that are pious. So his jealousy, his envy, caused the son of Adam to not realize the real reason for which the sacrifice was not accepted. Quran al-Karim just talks generally about the taqwa and the sincerity of the sacrifice. In the biblical version of the story, actually it's mentioned that Habil offered like a first born and a very prized animal, and that Qabil offered like some kind of undesirable crops. Okay? So we neither affirm nor deny this, we don't know. But we know that in general, the real reason was not unfairness, was not preferential treatment. It was taqwa and sincerity, which if it was corrected, would resolve the issue. But hasad can be blinding. And you really see that in the story of the children of Adam. Not only is the reason obvious, not only is it clear that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not play favorites, hasha lillah, right? Does not haphazardly give it. But it was explicitly said to him. He said, إِنَّمَا يَتَقَبَّلُ اللَّهُ مِنَ الْمُتَّقِينَ. If you missed it, it was said explicitly. This is the reason Allah accepts from the pious. So fix it, and I'll take care of the issue. Hasad can be very, very blinding, which is why it's really a powerful tool of the shaitan. Because the positive jealousy, meaning that a person see a bounty and aspire to it without wishing destruction for others, right? It helps a person balance between taking material means, meaning that sometimes I see something, I wish it, and I start rushing to it because I see it's desirable. And the characteristic of ar-rida, contentment, being satisfied with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave. Meaning what? Meaning, for example, a person sees a beautiful recitation of the Quran. Tonight is a Nur Quran Academy. MashaAllah, you see some of these bright 10, 12-year-olds reading Quran, and I'm still struggling. You know, it's not that easy for me. So alhamdulillah, I wish nothing but good for them, but I have that aspiration. That's not hasad, right? It's being aspired. Then you ask yourself, when hasad is out of the way, you ask yourself, how did they get there? How did any reciter get to recitation of the Quran? He got through, or she gets through it through practice, through courage, to sit in front of the teachers, right? The top level huffaz have made thousands upon thousands until they got to tens of thousands of mistakes in the Quran al-Kareem, because even their mind, not just like the
big mistakes, but that are corrected in Taraweeh, right? But the minor mistakes in a classroom setting, they're all being caught, right? Sheikh Saad al-Ghamdi, who many of you have heard, tells a story about how when, reciting al-Fatiha, to get out of Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim took about half hour, 45 minutes in one of his classes, right? And this was after he's a famous reciter. Wallahi, I saw a very, very respected, learned teacher of Quran and Imam and Qari in the Washington, D.C. area growing up, when there was a visiting scholar, and this person, maybe he was running a Quran school, an Imam of a masjid, and, but a visiting scholar, senior scholar of Quran, Wallahi al-Azim, after Salah, privately, I'm telling you something, it wasn't an embarrassing situation, started telling him about how to better his recitation of Fatiha after 40 years of experience. But he respected that scholarship, because there's something that says, don't touch me, you know what I mean? Like, I'm too good for this. So those students are quieting that arrogance. Wallahi, in class, Quran class sometimes, not in a debasing way, but in a humble way. You get treated like a child. I remember like being really intimidated in front of the sheikh. And he said, so, I was like, imam, etc., at this point, but I'm still sitting in the class. It's an honor sitting in the class. And the sheikh says, son, loosen that statue on your shoulders. You know what I mean? And again, you have to like, calm down. It's just a classroom, right? But again, when you see this, you're like, well, which one of those can I not do? Why can't I humble myself? Why can't I study? Why can't I, why can't I be pleased with my level? But also to avoid hasad takes contentment. Because sometimes you see a bounty that Allah gave another person that's out of your reach or that will not come. For example, you see a person that has been given something in health that is not in your risk or in the risk of someone you care about. Or has been given something of freedom from disease or a disease that your household has been tested with, right? Or the people all across the world that look at us that are tested with relative ease and comfort compared to almost the entire rest of the world. People that are caught in endless war and violence and lack of opportunity, many places in the world, sadly, right? So also this contentment must be brought to bear, because not every bounty that is desired can be acquired. But that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not bring us to account for the results, He brings us to account for the asbab, the efforts. A practical tip that I actually learned from a session with the National Speakers Association. When you go to a typical conference or a Muslim event and you hear somebody's bio, what does it typically create in people? So many bios, right? Bios are because you're introducing yourself to an audience that doesn't know, so that your credentials understood what you can speak and not speak about. But in many of our institutions, our bios and so on and so forth are very, unhelpful. Why? Because when the bio says such and such studied with the premier, this and this and that, accomplished this, got 5 degrees and so on and so forth, what is that emphasizing? It's emphasizing the final destinations that are out of reach. That's appropriate in more of a public speaking session, in total strangers, where you're, for example, speaking about Islam in front of a group of totally mixed faith audiences. You have to credential yourself, you have to make yourself more believable than the random person they picked up and threw on TV. That's appropriate. But particularly in front of Muslim audiences, what should be emphasized? The Muslim audiences that do not know you, what should be emphasized is the means that it took to get there. Because when we say such and such memorized Quran at 10 years old, has the 5, that has this, that's emphasizing all the things that I don't have that that person has. But when we say they're the lifelong student of the Quran al-Kareem, it's studied for such and such years and did this. Well, guess what? I can study too, or I can say my focus is somewhere else. May Allah grant tawfiq to the students of this, I'm a student of something else. You see what I'm saying? So particularly with youth groups, with MSAs, with Muslim audiences, we have to be very cognizant to, there's no harm in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَأَمَّا بِنِعْمَةِ رَبِّكَ فَحَدِّثْ, right? That to share and mention the favors of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We talked last time about dressing properly and good appearance without arrogance. But also you should recognize that the issue of credentialing oneself is different based on the audience. If the audience knows you, it really becomes very pointless to mention a Bible if they're known. If it's a Muslim audience, an audience of people that are going for a similar objective, then emphasize the means. If it's a more public or debate or whatever type of environment, then you can emphasize the accolades and accomplishments because it's contextualized in that situation. It's not really serving you, it's serving the message because you're starting from a point of skepticism and you're breaking the first barrier of skepticism. So always, just like in dress, you know, dress is really more about the rights of others than the rights of oneself, right? That a person is dressed not so that their nose can be in the sky, but so that they can have a good appearance towards others and be pleasing to deal with, and you know, not harm others by a disheveled experience or difficult odors or whatever. But it's not to make a person arrogant. So you should be very cautious about that in credentialing oneself in bios, etc., not to invite hasaned, number one, but number two also to have an objective that serves the message, not the ego. The whole point of bios and all this stuff anyway is to serve the message, not the ego, right? It's to create space for people to understand who's in front of them and to accept it, which is why from the very early generations of Muslim scholarship, anonymous writings about Islamic scholarship were discarded. Because people have the right to understand who is the originator of this speech and what is their proof. When a student of Imam Malik was challenged on a particular ruling, and he said, Qala Malik, Malik claimed this. The response was, both you and your teacher need proof, right? So this is not an original source proof in Islam. The source proof is from the Quran and the Sunnah, right? And so it's very, very important and part of credentialing and tracing scholarship in Islam. So the Prophet ﷺ said, لا تحاسدوا ولا تناجشوا. This nash is a type of essentially financial taking advantage of one another. There's a couple different opinions on it, but yeah, by way of summary, we could consider it as not artificially raising prices against one another. Right? And it's called in Arabic an-najash, just like al-hasad. This is an-najash, right? N-A-J-A-S-H. So most scholars, or many scholars, interpret this to be specific to business dealings. And the prohibition here is that neither the buyer nor the seller artificially bids up the price of an item to hurt the buyer or help the seller, right? And in particular, a simple example, right? It's not an auction so much as it's a person that doesn't want the item, right? But imagine three people, a seller, a buyer, and a person that's secretly helping the seller, doesn't really want to buy the item, but every time they bid up a little bit more because they know they really want it, and then it keeps up. That would be one construct of artificially bidding up the prices. And obviously, from Enron and everything else, right, that these schemes and pyramid schemes and whatever get very, very sophisticated. So this is just a simplified example. But particularly in, the tricks and games of the modern economy, these become very sophisticated and eventually harm people. And one big issue in this country is just that the policy debates on effective economic policies get stifled by all this lobbying and special interests. so that wealth inequality continues to grow in this country, right? And we're not saying, certainly, Islam does not espouse, socially, in an economic sense, pure, social and communist values, nor does it emphasize capitalist values in the sense of with no regard to the destruction caused to others, just get another dollar. But it is very important among Islamic principles, as evidenced by many ayat and hadith, is the free exchange and commerce and transactions and buying and selling. It's part of the healthy economy and healthy property structure of people. This could be a whole lecture in and of itself, but it's well evidenced. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَأَحَلَّ اللَّهُ الْبَيْعَ وَحَرَّمَ الرِّبَا. Allah has permitted commercial transactions and forbidden riba, or usury, right? Which is one form of this predatory commercial transaction that takes advantage of one over another. But in this country, one thing that could be criticized, first of all, in terms of developed, or high GDP countries, right? It's interesting that the United States ranks around 34th or somewhere in the mid-30s, excuse me, in terms of wealth disparity. In other words, that this enormous wealth that is in this country is disproportionately goes more and more to the rich, such that the gap keeps growing. And while people are stuck in levels of poverty that are below living wages, meaning that even if they're in public housing, even if they're working full time, that they're never able to make enough to afford to make an income 3 times the rent in the area where they're living, right? Which means that they're stuck. This is part of the objectives, by the way, of a zakah, which is to ensure, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned both al-fuqara and al-masakeen. Fuqara are those that are destitute, extremely poor, have almost nothing. So they're easier to identify. Allah speaks about al-masakeen. One description is لا يسألون الناس إلحافا. They do not ask people out of shyness and so on, and they're harder to identify because in English sometimes they call them the working poor, because they're working full time, they're working 2 or 3 jobs, but they never have enough income to get out of the cycle, right? To get out of poverty. These people are eligible for zakah in Islam. Those that have enough income to meet some of their necessities, but not all of the essentials and basics needed for that. They're eligible for zakah to get out of this cycle so that they can actually have a stable and eventually build, wealth or comfort at least, to have their needs sufficed. Actually, zakah eligible, not just sadaqah eligible. So I want to emphasize that this is more than just this rudimentary version of, okay, don't artificially build up. No, this is part of a holistic whole, that these games eventually harm and hurt people. And if the minimum wage actually in the United States had kept pace with the growth of top line wages, do you know what the minimum wage would be right now? Many districts such as Durham have identified $15 as a living wage, right? What's needed to make that mark, right, to get out of that cycle. But in fact, just statistically, if they had grown at the same rate, it would be $33 today. And in addition, in the 70s, the top level, the CEO or equivalent, compared to the lowest financial compensation employee in a company, the ratio was about 70 to 1, right? That was in the 70s. Today, it's actually more than 300 to 1. So you see the gap keeps growing, right? And so these are some related lessons in some areas for further research, inshallah, which you could investigate, but specifically being very, very cautious about this. Again, being fiscally responsible and smart is different from exploiting people, right? And so if you're tracking your charitable contributions, obviously you're giving it primarily for ajr anyway, but if you're also tracking and trying to land in the right tax bracket, what's wrong with that, right? you're able to, buy, if you're kind of thrifty, you buy good quality stuff at a better price, that puts more money in your hands so that you can affect positive change in it. So the believer is not allergic to dunya. You understand what I'm saying? Dunya is how you make change. What are the tools by which you make change? It's time, effort, money. So good planning and financial responsibility helps you have those tools, or attempt to take effort, means to have those tools to make positive change. But that's very different than exploiting people or seeking a dollar on the back of another person. And that's what is prohibited in all of its forms, including the present one, which is called what? Which is called an-najash. See, you walked out with a new word today. We all know hastened, mashallah. We've been taught that since we were 5 years old, but today we learned an-najash, right, which is fine. And then the Prophet ﷺ says, وَلَا تَبَغَضُوا, which means do not hate one another, right? Do not hate one another and do not harbor hatred and animosity for one another. One of the ugliest forms of this is to hate another person because of their nationality or the color of their skin or their origin, but there are other forms, right? Not hating people for their social, status, for their economic status, for their wealth. In fact, essentially, the only form of hatred permitted in Islam to another person is hatred for what? This is a tricky question. What is the highest form of love for another person? It is the love for sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So also, this is a little tricky, but the only permitted, sanctioned reason for hatred is what? Hatred for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Meaning that it's the principle, it's not the person, right? So when there were unrepentant people, a good example is, Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam in the Quran al-Kareem, so we can take a Quranic example beyond discussion, right? The Prophet Musa says, رَبَّنَا إِنَّكَ آتَيْتَ فِرْعَوْنَ وَمَلَأَهُ زِينَةً وَأَمْوَالًا فِي الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا رَبَّنَا لِيُضِلُّوا عَنْ سَبِيلِكَ. Oh Allah, you have granted the Pharaoh and his elites on, zina, like adoration and material wealth and money. Oh Allah, what have they used it for? To take people away from your path. It wasn't that he said, oh Allah, I came to his court and he said I raised you when you were young. It wasn't that he embarrassed me in front of people. It was purely this opposition was for the principle, not for the ego. This is very hard to do. This takes work. It doesn't happen by accident. Because the ego naturally rebels for the self. You start hating a person because they embarrassed you, because they put you in a compromising situation. To get rid of that is an action, is to forgive, is to let go. If you forgive, if you forgive and pardon and let go, that's an action, that's all active. Otherwise, a lot of hatred that is harbored, supposedly in the name of good, is actually in the hatred in the name of the ego, right? And it is not rid without action. It does not get rid by accident. And then finally, the Prophet ﷺ says, وَلَا تَدَابَرُوا, do not turn your back on one another. And this can be understood in a number of ways, but among them, cutting off relations and boycotting another person. In another narration, actually, Muslim specifically mentions that cut off relations. One of the greatest sinful things is cut off what type of relation? Right? The relationship of the family or the rahim. But in general, this speaks about we should be open to one another and not permanently cut off one another. There are occasional exceptions on this that are very situational, that are very dependent on a particular relationship having been unrepentant after counseling, after support, having an extreme abuse in it. For example, those cases exist, Those cases are not what you're going to hear about in the minbar or in the classroom, because those are always contextualized, and those are not the norm. The norm is the prohibition of cutting off relationships, because often those reasons are not there. But certainly in situations of abuse, in situations of extreme unrepentance in a particular relationship, really exploiting it, these are situations where a person should seek individualized, qualified, trustworthy advice. Okay? And on occasion, fatwa and rulings are given for that exceptional case, but it remains an exception. Some people are tested as Prophet Ibrahim was tested, with a father that is difficult to handle, difficult to deal with, right? It's a very extreme example. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala recompensed Prophet Ibrahim with a very happy household, with exemplary spouses, with amazing children. Everything he did for his father came back to him in life multiple folds, much less in the hereafter. But he never treated his father on the terms that his father treated him, right? When his father said, that I will stone you, Prophet Ibrahim responded with what? Salam, meaning that from me you will never have anything but peace. I can control only my end. That doesn't mean be obnoxious and call every 5 minutes and look to, you see what I'm saying? Because sometimes excessive relationships, when there's tension, cause more harm. Sharia is never seeking to bring more harm. But he did not cut him off. He did not initiate harm in his direction. When his father insisted on this distance, then he left it alone and insisted what was coming from him was peace. Okay? And again, dealing with this is an art, and it takes one-on-one advice if a person is tested with a difficult situation like this, as happens. Sometimes Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala selects a person for this test. Again, it's not the norm. Many prophets had exemplary wives, but Prophet Nuh and Prophet Lut were tested with very, very, difficult, not just difficult, but like, kafir and rejecting women. Many women were blessed with great men, but the wife of Fir'aun was tested with one of the worst human beings to ever walk the planet, right? Prophet Ibrahim was tested in his father. Prophet Nuh had a believing son, but he had a rejecting son that hid his rejection. So it was a big shock and a very emotional test for Prophet Nuh when his son, tested him in this way. So we should understand that our Sharia encompasses this. But the norm is, الطيبون للطيبات طيبات للطيبين والطيبون للطيبات. That good men, women are for good men and good men are for good women. But these are tests. Nobody gets dunya as a complete share. Everybody has their test in business, in family, in work, in health. Nobody gets Jannah on earth. That only happens on Instagram, right? You take snapshots and you give me 0.1% of a person's life that turned out to be Jannah. Okay, but the rest of the 99.9%, it's dunya. You understand what I'm saying? It's not Jannah, it's dunya. Jannah happens up there. And then he says, again, another form of commercial taking advantage of one another. Do not undercut one another in business transactions. Do not undercut one another in business transactions. So this was, don't do this, don't do that, don't, all of these prohibitions. In another narration, the Prophet ﷺ starts with eavesdropping, right? And then eavesdropping leads to what? Spying on one another, right? And so he says that hassasu, do not eavesdrop on one another. Do not spy on one another. Do not have hasad of one another. Do not envy one another, right? Do not cut off relationships with one another, and do not become enemies with one another, right? So again, you have kind of a sequential, complementary narration of the hadith to avoid eavesdropping, which inevitably leads to spying, which leads to envy, which leads to cutting off relationships, which leads to becoming, having enmity and being spiteful of one another. And then the Prophet ﷺ mentions a command that protects us from all of this and enjoins its opposite. وَكُونُوا عِبَادَ اللَّهِ إِخْوَانًا. Be servants of Allah, brothers and sisters to one another. This is the affirmative command of this hadith. Have you ever been to like an event where a Muslim speaker says brothers and sisters and so on and so forth? It's an interfaith event. And then like every speaker after that calls the audience brothers and sisters, right? I don't know if you've ever, I've been to many of those events, right? And then all of a sudden, people that don't have this concept in their religion, but such a powerful concept, brothers and sisters, I want to tell you this, right? It's different from ladies and gentlemen, right? It's different from sirs and madams, right? Such a powerful concept. So I want to emphasize to this audience and to myself, to each other, that because this is so powerful, sometimes we forget to remind ourselves that because we've been brought up with it, we forget its true power. This hadith is advice based on love, based on tolerance, based on compassion, and based on getting along with one another. That's what this hadith is about. Not just that. This hadith is saying that this is by nature the state of the Muslim. This is by nature the behavior of the believer. By nature, it is expected that they are avoiding of these envy, financial taking advantage of one another, hatred, enmity, spite, and that their natural state is what? As brothers and sisters to one another. When you realize that, it's like, wow, this is deep, right? This is deep. That means that the opposite is linked to what? It's linked to an opportunity for growth in Iman. Because this is the state of the believer, right? A person of more complete Iman has greater distance from these things. And so when these things have a part of our lives, and most of us are tested with some portion of these vices, and that means that's an opportunity for Iman growth. This isn't extra credit. This isn't Super Muslim 101. This is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's statement and the Prophet's statement about the natural disposition of the believer. It's emphasized more than once in the hadith. وَكُونُوا عِبَادَ اللَّهِ إِخْوَانًا. Be servants of Allah, brethren to one another. And then the Prophet says, Al-Muslimu akhul Muslim. The Muslim is the brother or the sister of their fellow Muslim. Then he continues, لا يظلمه ولا يخذله ولا يكذبه ولا يحقره. Does not oppress him, does not fail him, does not lie to him, does not hold him in contempt. It's the natural state of Iman among people. This explanation of this part, or further explanation of this part, comes in the next hadith, so I'm not going to comment on it extensively right now because it comes in a very complimentary way. But I think it is understood at face value, even if when you explore it more, but particularly I want to highlight the part about not failing one another in a state of need in particular, right? So we've spoken about dhulm extensively, right? And dhulm can come in large and small forms. Remember, dhulm is not just like reserved for Fir'aun. Some people get very offended when you say something is dhulm or wrongdoing. Remember, dhulm is any small or large thing that is out of place, thing of wrong, right? And so a sharp-tongued email is absolutely part of dhulm, right? Speaking about a person behind their back is absolutely dhulm to that person. Gossiping about people's private lives or exposing their secrets is absolutely a form of dhulm. It is greater dhulm to be Fir'aun. It is greater dhulm to enslave people. But this is dhulm nonetheless, and it is to be avoided and removed by the nature of the Sharia. Okay? And so, in the coming ahadith, talking about things like visiting the sick, caring for people, seeing to their needs, This is one of the hadith that has emphasized this in وَلَا يَقْتُلُوا. They don't let each other down. They don't fail one another. And one of the places where you fail people most is when they're in a state of need or vulnerability. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَتَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْبِرِّ وَالتَّقْوَى. Support one another, help one another in acts of righteousness and piety. We want to mention another hadith here that's very, very important about this issue of support, an issue I've seen that is misapplied by many people. The Prophet ﷺ says, "Unsur akhaka zaliman aw mazlum." Help your brother, whether he is the one doing wrong or the one being wronged. Anybody understand the hadith yet? Now, if you understand the hadith, you don't have the reaction that the companions had, right? Because the Prophet ﷺ said, help your brother, whether he is oppressing or, while he is the one doing wrong or the one being wrong. So how do you help someone being wrong? But how do you help someone doing wrong? Right? And so here the companions asked for clarification, as was mentioned being invited. قالوا يا رسول الله هذا ننصره مظلوما فكيف ننصره ظالما قال تأخذ فوق يده. This is one wording, there's another wording. But they asked, O Messenger of Allah, we know how to help him when he's being wronged. But how do we help him if the one's doing wrong? He answered, take him by his hand. Or another, the other wordings give the meanings, advice, telling them to stop, helping them get over the wrong. Doesn't mean help them do more wrong. Let's be very clear, right? Muslims are principled, not partisan. Wrong is wrong, whether it's done by you or a Muslim or someone else. It's not only wrong when it's done by someone you don't like. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah An-Nisa, O you who believe, stand forth as witnesses stand forth for justice as witnesses to God, even if against yourselves or your parents or your next of kin. So the issue here is the principle. But specifically supporting a person when they're doing wrongs to help them stop doing that wrong, to advise them, right? To give them direction, to give them support, to get out of this cycle, right? And many of us fall into this trap that we're happy to do this with others, but not happy to do it in the mirror. Or we're happy to do it with people that are not in our close circle of friends, but we don't have the courage to do it with our circle of friends. The best friends are the ones that are mirrors to you. They reflect your most radiant accomplishments, but they also reflect blemishes so that you can work to correct them and change them. He does not lie to him, and he does not show contempt to them. And then the Prophet ﷺ says, At-Taqwa hahuna, right? He said that taqwa, piety, is here. And he pointed at his chest 3 times. This has so many meanings, right? Among them, as comes in another hadith that the Prophet that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Prophet says that Allah does not look to your forms or your figures, but He looks to the hearts that are in the chests, right? So the core of piety is, based on a person's conduct, and as comes in the Quran al-Kareem, إِنَّ أَكْرَمَكُمْ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ أَتْقَاكُمْ. The most honorable of you in the sight of God are the most pious and righteous amongst you. Then the Prophet ﷺ says, it is enough evil for a person to hold his or her brother or sister Muslim in contempt. A man came to the Prophet ﷺ once, and he was not one of the regular, companions that lived near. And this person was, when he turned away and walked away, the Prophet ﷺ witnessed that this person was a person of Jannah. So the companions were so eager to understand what this man had that actually one of the companions stayed with him for some time and observed his worship, but found his salah, his fasting, not far exceeding or like the other things till he could find no explanation. And when it was mentioned to him what he said, that could perhaps be the reason why the Prophet ﷺ gave this testimony, was that when he sleeps, his heart is free of contempt to all people. All of us go through trauma, go through hardship, go through difficulty. I want to be very clear. When we talk about tazkiyah and spirituality, we are not sweeping dhulm under the rug. We are not okaying mistreatment of others. We are not saying don't seek support or a therapist or counselor or advice. We are not saying stop working toward injustice. But part of the discussion that is often missed, particularly if we sit a lot in social justice circles and don't complement it with circles of kind of personal enrichment, is that there is a tazkiyah response. What do you do with your heart when the action is done? If it's happened, you can't stop it. A colleague, Imam, once shared the story of a man, an adult man now, but he was tested by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. His father really wasn't there for him. And his father not only wasn't there for them, but again, speaking about when this adult was young, could be abusive to his family. This is decades ago, right? This man, is 40s or 50s now. And his dad passed away. And my colleague Imam got a call. And this gentleman asked, should I go to the janazah? What would you answer? The Imam advised him based on him and his father. He told him, brother, you have got to let go. You have to forgive this man for yourself. You have to forgive for yourself. Still your father. So you see how difficult these tests are, that even death did not relieve this man of this very heavy test, but to free his heart. Right? This is literally what he said. You have to free yourself. That's how the Imam put it. He said, you have got to free yourself, brother, because he's trapping himself in the confines of this person. He's trapping himself in the confines of this trauma. When I was undergoing some training, this was before our, alhamdulillah, what became our health training. Our health team, and some of you remember the Imam's initiative on behavior and mental health. But one of the people I consulted was a gentleman, mashallah, who has a degree in Sharia, but also does very advanced therapy. And I thought that he had that great mix, and we spoke extensively about shaping now what is the IR health services. So this man is extremely highly, he takes very severe cases. And one case was a person who had gone through such betrayal, such really, really hard, difficult experience from a person that was very close to her. And it was with her so much that, in particular, one incident where she had experienced, rape and real hardship, kept coming back to her in her nightmares and kept reliving it. And she kept sitting with therapist after therapist, and this young woman experiencing this incredible hardship, her whole life was debilitated by this experience. And interestingly, when she conversed with this senior therapist, he asked her a question. He asked her, this awful experience, this unspeakable experience, how many times did he inflict it on you? She had experienced it once. One horrible, unspeakable experience, but once. After that, they never met again. Esther, how many times has your mind inflicted it on yourself? She had relived this maybe 80 or 90 times. That was the beginning of her overcoming this trauma and reclaiming her full life back. That doesn't happen in a lecture. I'm giving you 2 examples. Those examples will not help a person overcome trauma. That's why we really emphasize good connection to the appropriate resources and the appropriate specializations. But I want to differentiate a speech from a situation, a national conference from a person's life. While we continue to vigorously talk about the global end, ending these practices, stopping abuse, stopping these experiences, a human life is a human life, and sometimes you need to take someone by the hand and help them get over or support them in overcoming their trauma. You understand what I'm saying? Particularly in local service, never conflate the two. Never mix the two up. One of the challenges of our Muslim community is that we have big words in thought leadership and almost no one to implement it on the ground. We have incredibly vibrant national conferences and a global shortage, a national shortage of men and women to serve locally serving institutions at every level of service, execution, and religious leadership. So it makes it very difficult to implement these solutions and write them into people's lives. Understand that this is the core of the Prophet ﷺ's mission. The Prophet ﷺ was the most beautiful orator of all people, the most eloquent of human beings. He and his other prophets could have gone around, spoken to a speech, gave a fiery speech, and said, if you wish, believe, and if you don't, and then go on to the next speech. What did the Prophet ﷺ spend 23 years with people on? 23 years. Quran is much shorter than the Bible, by the way, right? And the Prophet ﷺ's hadith, most of them take 10 seconds to read, right? They're very short, 15 seconds to read. What is taking 23 years? Follow up with people. Not just that, but in these 23 years, he overwhelmingly focused his efforts on a limited group of people that were such powerful change makers that they carried the message to the corners of the globe. There are more than 100,000 companions. But most of the Prophet's time and attention, the direct benefit came to hundreds of companions or thousands that were around him. And especially within that, a core group that the names are most famous, right? Among the mothers of the believers, Abu Bakr, Umar, until the end of it. And these people were transformed so much that they took this message to the corner of the world. So very, very, very aware of that. In particular here, again, I'm not giving the whole story here. I'm focusing on a dimension that is often ignored. The importance of a person's own spiritual well-being and own freedom of heart in the face of harm and trauma. The Prophet ﷺ says it is enough of evil to hold another person in contempt. All of a Muslim is sacred and inviolable to another Muslim. Their blood, their property, and their honor. Another hadith, the Prophet ﷺ says that shedding the blood of a single person is more sacred with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala than the destruction of the Kaaba. Imagine how special the Kaaba is and how revered it is. The Prophet ﷺ indicates that with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the violation of the blood of one person is a greater issue than the destruction of the Kaaba, which is huge, right? And subhanAllah, looking at so many people that are suffering with war and lives and property, they really remind us about the shameful situation worldwide. So the hadith closes talking about how evil it is to look down at someone else, right? To look at contempt with someone else and viewing a whole of a person as sacred. One of the really amazing statements, I think many of you may not have heard this before. It really affected me when I heard it. It's from Imam Sha'rawi, rahmahullah, 20th century Muslim scholar. But he said, when you look at what is haram, do not look at it that Allah has made prohibited for me, everyone else's property and this and that and the other. Look at it that Allah has protected your life, your property, your honor, your family from the eyes and hands of the rest of the world. Both are true, but typically the way we're taught haram is like, it's a list, it's more and more. No, actually haram coming from the root meaning sacred is a great protection from the person. People are protected from your harm, and you are protected from the harm of others, right? That these are the appropriate boundaries, inshallah. So, inshallah, it's an extensive hadith, there's a lot more to say, but this are some centering thoughts. We're going to have, inshallah, a case study on this hadith, but before that, inshallah, if you have any questions, please ask.
I just wanted to clarify on the ratio that you give, like after the $33 visits, the 70 to 1, what was that about?
This was the ratio of the lowest compensation person in a company to the highest compensation, right? So the lowest wage paid in a company compared to the wage of, say, the CEO. In the 1970s, it was about 70 to 1. Now it is more than 333 to 1, right? And so the gap is growing. A well-known example in our time is like, he mentions it for himself, right? That Warren Buffett pays a lower tax rate than his secretary, right? And so there's a lot of institutional structure that goes into, because there's a lot of wealth, but in this country, the rate of wealth growth for people is not even close to consistent, right? A lot more proportionally of the wealth is going to the highest earners, while some people are stuck not only below federal poverty rate, but below living wage. They will not get out without intervention. A woman in Durham actually said in her speech, my part-time job is searching for a living wage job. She's in public housing with her children. She works full-time at Bojangles, and at $8.25 an hour, there is not an apartment anywhere in Durham that you could afford at that salary, because you have to make typically 3 times more to get into a lease. So she's in public housing, but the public housing is not affordable enough to save up money for a period of time to get out. So she's stuck. And she shared about how I'm not looking up for handouts. I am working and I'm ready to work and even study if I could free my mind. But she's talking about structurally how a person is stuck in those situations. Other questions? Sheikh Sha'rawi talked about haram, looking at it as the benefits that one derives, not just the prohibitions that one experiences. So instead of saying, it is true, but instead of stopping at saying it is haram for me to, take the property of another or to look to the honor of another and so on and so forth, understand that Allah made for these 7 billion people, made it haram for someone to violate your property. Made it haram for someone to violate your family, for your honor. Made it haram for somebody to transgress or take your blood with them. That you got that benefit of, that 7 billion people are asked to respect the boundaries of the society.
I have a comment, a question, two questions. The comment is, when the hadith starts with do not be envious of one another, I can actually visualize in my mind that in fact, if you don't have envy, you will actually not do any of the prohibited acts. I can see that. The two questions I have is, in many Quran translations, the reference to Allah is always He, and I've always struggled with that, especially in the context of the grammatical comments you made today. is there a better word when that happens? So that's question one, if I can. And the second one is, many of the things that are prohibited here are also true for any other non-Muslims. You should not be taking the property of non-Muslims or honor and blood. So is there any particular preference being guided here, or is it what's going on?
So, okay, the first question about translation of the Quran using, for example, he is Allah. There's no better English expression that I know to translate the concept. It's a limitation of the language. It's really maybe explained further through footnote or explanation. It is also not improper in English, but it's kind of, the grammar is just not as well known. In English, it's called like a genderless pronoun, or actually a neutered pronoun. So it is appropriate to use the pronoun he for, for example, speaking about a person where it's not known if it's a boy, a young man or a young woman, or speaking, in this case, being Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I know of no grammatical better explanation. It's to be explained or defined. The second question is very important. I forgot to mention this, but we mentioned it last time as well. We'll emphasize it this time. That remember, there are many hadith and many texts talking about the protection of people's rights and lives and so on. This is not the only one. So anyway, we have a relationship of brotherhood and sisterhood with all of humanity because we're all the sons of Adam and Hawa, or Adam and Eve, right? And so there is a protection and an honor, and there's extensive evidence for the protection. And the default is that property rights, life rights, and so on extend to all people, right? Nonetheless, also, when you have on top of that your brotherhood and sisterhood in Islam, but you're also under the umbrella of La ilaha illallah, then that's another relationship, right? Takes it to another level, and that's what this hadith is emphasizing the special bond among Muslims, just as there are special bonds in other faith communities that they recognize among themselves, right? But that does not mean, as we know from other texts, that other people don't have their properties or their lives protected.
Going back to what you said about your brother, whether he was doing wrong or doing wrong, is there, the last thing you want to do is give advice to someone if you know you and one of how do you approach misdeeds, etiquette of
So, talking about how to do the advice, and especially since we recognize we're all sinful, all have shortcomings. We spoke about this a lot in the hadith on ad-din al-nasiha, hadith number 7. So you'll find more details, inshallah, in the notes, or if anybody missed that class, exchange notes with a partner. So we spoke about this extensively, but I want to remind you about a couple things. The proper nasiha is between two extremes, right? An extreme where I am policing people. I see myself above others, so therefore I kind of like bossing around and I enjoy the faults of others. That's a big problem. Person should never get to this extreme of enjoying the fault of another person or seeing that they somehow have special status, that they're above reproach, right? And that they're just boss other people around. But there's another extreme where I say, because I am, and I'm not saying extreme according to me, I'm saying according to Hadith, that we recognize there's another extreme where, because I'm sinful, because I don't know what's in the other person's heart, therefore I just stay silent. Whatever they do is what they do. It's hard to reconcile this attitude with our deen, in particular with this hadith, right? Ad-din al-nasiha, right? So this nasiha coming from sincerity means that when I see another person that is doing something wrong, right, I wish for that person to be empowered and enabled to change that behavior. And this couples with a general mission as a Muslim, al-amru bil ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar, commanding good and forbidding evil, which is not even limited to Muslims, right? It's bringing virtue into the world, right? It's speaking, the Prophet ﷺ, when the man came and, Abu Jahl would not give him his money, and they want to play a game on the Muslims because Muslims were in persecution and so on. So they played a joke on him. This poor man that can't get his money, he said, "Oh, there's one person in the city that will get it for you. His name is Muhammad." Right? So they figured that when he would come to him, he would say, "These people are playing a joke on me and you. They're torturing Bilal and doing this and doing. I can't even protect my people. How am I supposed to?" That's not what the Prophet ﷺ did. The Prophet ﷺ took the man, went up to Abu Jahl, and said, "Give this man his money." Right? He didn't ask him, "Are you Muslim? Because if you're Muslim, I'll get you your money." You see what I'm saying? It was bringing virtue into the world in general. So this extends even beyond Muslims. But this issue of al-nasiha falls in the middle, where my objective is to advise and empower the other person to make positive change. And the means that I select are the most effective means that I think will bring about benefit and not at the expense of a greater harm. What does that mean in practice? It means in practice that if you're walking into a masjid and one of our beloved, masjid uncles or masjid aunties come and kind of dress you down and yell at you, that's actually coming, you assume that that's coming from a good heart. Because they're not content to see, mashallah, we came, let's say, with, the clothes not quite set for salah, for this very special moment, and you come and say, "What's wrong with me? Why is this showing?" and so on and so forth. Is that the right way to give nasiha? It's definitely not. But what can I get from positive from there? That heart is saying, "I want to change it," just expressing it the wrong way. On the other hand, a person that's very, very gentle, but sees an opportunity to change and doesn't care that you get that advice. Is there a gap in that? Absolutely. Because it's not making a difference to them whether you receive that advice. It's your life, do whatever you want. It is your life, nobody's imposing on you. But that nasiha balance is that I have the intention to try to help my brothers and sisters get the best advice and so on and support, coupled with the best means. From that it becomes contextual, right? And so sometimes, for example, the story that's related about Al-Hasan and Al-Hussein, that they see a very elder man that's not making wudu correctly. And there's some weakness in narration, it could be two other people. But let's say two wise people. So what's going to happen if two young men tell a man that's that's the age of their grandfather, "You don't know how to make wudu"? You think that's going to work out very well? That's not going to work out very well. So what do? They do role playing. One of them walks in making wudu right way. The other person makes it wrong way on purpose. And they have a discussion so the man understands it. See what I'm saying? That's an example of effective nasiha. If you have a cousin, a relative, or whatever, that you feel like they're not getting, maybe the courtship or the marriage discussion with their parents is not going that well. And, it's your uncle or your aunt. How do you think it's going to work out if you walk up to them and tell them, "Uncle and auntie, I'm not married, but I'm going to tell you how, to search for marriage"? How do you think that conversation is going to go? But if you feel like you have a point to make, and there's a respected family elder or community figure or whatever that has the same view, and you go catalyze that they do that. You see what I'm saying? So nasiha doesn't have to be from your tongue, right? And in general, nasiha has to be in private. Very, very rarely that nasiha is legislated in public. Similarly, pick a good time and a good place. Like an MSA event happens. Remember I was running, every time I mention these examples, I remember the delights that the Muslims bring to my plate, right? So I remember this MSA event, and it was very successful. And clearly this brother was very distressed that this MSA fundraising had went well, right? And so it really was coming to time to be met with, right? And it would be very appropriate to offer nasiha that, "Hey, this event is winding down, but can we streamline it so we don't miss the salah?" The brother came up, made this scene that, alhamdulillah, we laughed off. But he said, "Are you guys planning to count money all night, or are you planning to pray with Allah?" You see what? So again, we're halfway. We've got a good heart to try to bring the advice, but the manner is totally wrong, right? And so we want to combine both. In my constructive criticism of myself and others, I think the younger generation very much errs towards this side. We conflate that we're all sinless, we're all can't tell anybody what to do, and so we're just silent. So what happens is that people end up not receiving advice or good counsel, right? They're doing their best, but they're not getting it. And many of our elders or many of the, let's say, regulars at the masjid, we associate with tending towards the other side, right? Very forceful and quick to advise. The balance is right in the middle. You should care and you should advise, but in the best way. Okay, so hadith number 7 has a lot more. Let's have one.
Well, I just wanted to make a suggestion, and I hope it was very positive. And I think that sometimes in our communities, we don't have time to find a special place to have this training so people can come. An example, I think in the family, you have your family come and visit,
Yeah.
and then try to make it short, and then children might have children, business might have children. But sometimes the approach to Muslims who's coming in to tell them where they can sit. They can't sit because it's going to disturb people. But here you have a person who's not the same level that you are.
Yeah.
So that they come and immediately say, I'm not going back to the ministry. And it affects them because they are at a different level than you. And I deal with that kind of situation with people in my family who, when I talk to them about it, encourage them to come, just flashes all the time, just flashing back in their heads.
Yeah.
So I'm just putting that out. I know you all, we have trainings for people to know how to, committees to how to communicate with people instead of leaving them left with, I'm just not coming back disrespectfully. And everybody you can't always get to the person to save them.
Right. Jazakumullah khairan, very important point, and the importance of. So some practical tips in terms of organizational, dynamics. First of all, if you're, in a school or an MSA or in a youth group and so on, I suggest that you open regular channels to receive people's feedback. One mentor shared it with me like a pressure cooker. If you don't have that little air hole at the top, what happens, right? It builds up that pressure. So if you, to give some practical examples, not to say we're doing it right, but at IER, for example, on Jummah, there's a regular thing on, Jummah feedback on the website. You can click on it, and it gets recorded, and it comes to the education committee and myself. I read everyone personally. So if someone comes up to me after Jummah and says, I have feedback, I listen. I say, Jazakumullah khairan. For this to be formally reported, I'd invite you to record it here. So it'll be there, and it'll be formally reviewed. We won't formally review. I'll take it personally, but it will not be formally reviewed until it's recorded in that method. 8 or 9 out of 10 people never do that. So that's fine. I took the moment from that, but clearly did not distress them enough to go and spend 3 minutes writing it and put it in front of the eyes of someone else. I'm not going to judge the intention. I'm going to treat it at that level of seriousness. On your way out, to the left of the doors, there's a suggestion box. It doesn't force you to put your name. Why? Because if people want to have anonymous feedback, then we can see is it 1 voice, is it 5, is it 20? Strategic planning survey. But there's a lot of gaps, and I think you identified one of the biggest ones here at your masjid and elsewhere, is that volunteers are so hard to come by that we don't have very structured training. Often they get so overwhelmed. So part of, and if any of you are passionate to make a difference on this, I encourage you, find 3 other people, let's get our hands on deck. So part of the strategic planning implementation, inshallah, is that we are standardizing training for shura members, volunteers, etc. And actually at this masjid now, you can be fired as a volunteer. You have to do that. Now, I'm telling you right now, I'm not going to be where I want to be in Ramadan. Why? Because we're not going to have enough volunteers. But as a start, we're going to have that as a start. There's expectations of your volunteer. I don't care if I'm gray until you put me in the grave. Like, we're going to have that expectation until people step forward. But that's part of it. Right now, it's not implemented, so it's an opportunity for any of you, particularly sisters. because particularly in Ramadan we have much less volunteers on the sisters' side. But to help really effectively deal with the challenges of the space, of that would be one constructive step, inshallah. If you want to bring people that are motivated, Sister Charity is leading that effort in terms of the implementation, and one of the implementation things that she's supervising is implementing standardized training for volunteers, for shura, and for staff at this masjid. And that's something a lot of nonprofits have, but not a lot of masajid have. That's one step, but I appreciate you very constructively bring that suggestion, and I'm the first to raise our hand and say, we're not where we want to be, but I think, alhamdulillah, many of us are trying to walk it.
If I can offer the suggestion, and I know exactly what the sister is talking about, I think it's important before Ramadan to kind of have, maybe you kind of record something, say them, not necessarily in a khutbah, but kind of as a reminder. Say, this is what we're expecting during Ramadan. Ramadan is coming up, inshallah. These are the expectations. And I think reiterating expectations, reiterating what is appropriate versus not appropriate. We get into it as sisters, the sisters that want to bring their children to celebrate Taqwa, the sisters who are chit-chatting or whatever. This is the bulk of the back and forth. And people who are, like you were saying, not at that level, we need to set expectations. This is what we would like to see during Taqwa prayer. This is the etiquette of the masjid, kind of a refresher, a 101, Ramadan 101, this is what we would like to see. And I think if we are reminded of that, we all need the reminder.
I think that's a great suggestion. I'm not putting you on the spot, but I'm putting the class on the spot. Would anybody here like to commit to me that in the next week, you can look up Imsake on the website, pull up what was published last year, and you can write, inshallah, what guidelines and expectations you'd like to see, and I'll take it the rest of the way. So anybody would like to raise your hands to commit to that? So look around. No, raise your hand high, because it's a commitment. Okay? So can the three of you connect, inshallah, just after class today? But it's being published soon, so I'll need it by next Saturday, please, inshallah. I appreciate the suggestion, but that way it can be actionable. Inshallah, if anybody.
No, if you can share an email ID with them so they can write to it, and maybe education and stuff.
Yeah, so Brother Yusuf, could you connect with these three sisters? And anybody else that wants to volunteer, but we have three, inshallah, that are committed.
Yeah, Assalamu alaikum. I'm the education committee, so if you can, anybody has any suggestion, anything to make a change, write at education@islam1.org. That email is already on the website. You can go there and just share your, whatever change you want, and we'll take it, prioritize it. This is feedback that came for Ramadan preparation. We're working on it, so any feedback would always be welcome. You can see the change, the screen that we put in here, that came from the sisters. So somebody came and talked about it, and so you have it. Before that, we had single screen hanging in the middle over here. People would knock their head on it, and our sisters praying in front couldn't see anything. So that's a positive change that happened because somebody came forward and spoke about it. So that's the best.
Do you have a template over there? What kind of?
Yes.
You have
So on raleigh-masjid.org, you can search Sakeenah, and that'll pull up the last year's PDF. And that will have the guidelines. You don't need to be restricted by that, but if you like anything, you do it. If not, you can write something totally new, inshallah. And I think that'll be a big addition, especially on the sister side. Again, I'm not doing this in an IR session, but this is very practical. And in particular, I want to see actions brought into existence. And so I appreciate, mashallah, each of you volunteering not only to suggest, but to act on it, because I think this is the reality of community work, right? And what you see here is actually phase one. And it was picked up by one donor. One donor, actually, everything downstairs and upstairs was one single donor. So, look, I have to respect that because I meet a lot of people that talk and not a lot of people that act. So, this is not that. And when phase 3 is done, this will still not be an ideal space, right? Ideally, we would accommodate both brothers and sisters in the full space. And wallahi, you hook me up with $25 million. We'll put your dream on Page Road, okay? So Oh, not me personally. I don't want to see this on Twitter today. The masjid with $25 million. Then the masjid will put it on page row. Till then, we have to deal with reality. And that's part of, I'm inviting your questions, but I'm also pushing back for positive action to invite the best of us, inshallah. With that, I want to ask you to stand up, if you can. There we go. I want you to turn to 5 people, one of whom has something to write with. And I want you to write down at least 3 things, practical suggestions, that would raise the level of brotherhood and sisterhood in the broader triangle Muslim community based on this hadith. Put it on a separate sheet from your note because I'm going to ask for this paper back. So writing at least 3 things that would raise brotherhood and sisterhood in the triangle Muslim community. Done. One more minute, inshallah. Okay, let's come back together, inshallah. Let's come back to our seats, inshallah. Please. All right, we have, if you can take the sheets, inshallah, that you prepared, and go ahead and pass them to the center and then pass them up. And Jazakallah khair for participating in that. We also have a couple of quick announcements, inshallah. So, first, Sister Salma, inshallah, go ahead. Can we have one conversation, inshallah, please?
Oh, could you bring that up? Could you bring that up here?
Everyone, I checked the people. I checked everyone.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm speaking on behalf of Baitul Mal. Have you guys heard of Baitul Mal? Means house of wealth in Arabic. And they're a relief organization. They do fundraising and relief work in Yemen and Palestine, in the United States, and all over the world. They recently had a fundraiser for Yemen. In the McKinley Center, they raised about $24,000 for Yemen. And I have more pledge forms here. If you guys want to donate, I'm going to pass them around. You can put cash or fill out the form and put it in your mailbox, and it'll go to whatever program you want it to go to. Jazakallah khair.
Okay, we'll move to Hadith number 36, inshallah. Be very efficient on time. عن أبي هريرة رضي الله عنه عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال: من نفس عن مؤمن كربة من كرب الدنيا نفس الله عنه كربة من كرب يوم القيامة. ومن يسر على معسر يسر الله عليه في الدنيا والآخرة. ومن ستر مسلما ستره الله في الدنيا والآخرة. والله في عون العبد ما كان العبد في عون أخيه. ومن سلك طريقا يلتمس فيه علما سهل الله له به طريقا إلى الجنة. ما اجتمع قوم في بيت من بيوت الله يتلون كتاب الله ويتدارسونه بينهم إلا نزلت عليهم السكينة وغشيتهم الرحمة وحفتهم الملائكة وذكرهم الله في من عنده. ومن بطأ به عمله لم يسرع به نسبه. رواه مسلم. Very profound hadith that is, inshallah, understood in its apparent meaning, and we'll make some brief comments, and we'll take it in parts. On the authority of Abu Hurairah, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be pleased with him, who said that the Prophet, peace and blessing be upon him, said, whoever removes a worldly grief from a believer, Allah will remove from him one of the griefs of the day of resurrection. Whoever alleviates the need of a needy person, Allah will alleviate his needs in this world and the hereafter. And whoever shields or hides the misdeeds of a Muslim, Allah will shield him in this world and the hereafter. And Allah will aid his slave as long as he aids his brother. We'll pause the translation here and look at this section. This hadith and a number of hadith in this section are now talking about bringing these teachings into life. And a lot of the hadith talk about different aspects of serving human beings. A lot of it is very individual. A lot of it is not necessarily in the spotlight. A lot of it is not necessarily appreciated or gets a lot of accolades. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a shakur, the most appreciative, who records and accepts the righteous deeds done for his sake. So these early statements of relieving a believer's distress or the need of anyone are very broad because they're intended that way. Sometimes a person is missing out, right? And we have FOMO, right? Fear of missing out. Sometimes a person is missing out on an event, on a sports event, on something a lot of fun, on a night out, because they're caring for an elderly person with their groceries month. We're caring for a parent. They're caring for a new resident of the area. They're looking after a refugee. All of these things and much more are certainly captured in the spirit of these early statements. And interestingly, there are a number of stories of our tradition where a particular figure is praised by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that really exemplified themselves in this area, but was not necessarily a great public figure or speaker, right? One of the most famous examples is the example of Uwais al-Qarni, rahimahullah. The best of the tabi'een, the khayr al-tabi'een, by the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, the generation of the successors, the generation after the companions. What's interesting is that this generation has amazing scholars, right? It has great narrators of hadith. It has incredible public speakers. It has very powerful military generals. It has political leaders, right? During the time of this generation, Islam touched west to the western reaches of Africa, to the Atlantic Ocean, and east to China. There's a lot of people that had a lot of accomplishments in that story. You see what I'm saying? And every facet of human life. But who did the Prophet ﷺ say was the best of this entire generation? A very poor, simple man who missed all of this action and drama and even missed meeting the Prophet ﷺ himself because he served an elderly woman, his mother, at the end of her life. Like, that's how weighty this person's heart was with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The scholars say there are many, I don't even know if I can speak for the rest of the class, like that statement itself takes 15 minutes to digest. Like, there are very weighty names in that generation, right? And this Uwais al-Qarni was recognized as higher than all of these amazing people. So this deen is a deen of ikhlas. It's a deen of sincerity. And deeds in public are much harder to be sincere in. That doesn't mean that we don't worship Allah in public. But as-Salaf as-Salih used to actually act on the assumption that all their deeds in public were not accepted. They'd start from the assumption that these public deeds, there's so many eyes and people that it's very hard to be mukhlis, so assume that they're not there. Let me start doing good deeds that people don't appreciate, don't know, so I can be more certain of my sincerity. From night prayer, from seeking the poor, from helping the poor, from seeing to the needs of people, from visiting the sick. All of these basics. And some of the great Sahaba, Umar ibn al-Khattab has this amazing statement where he says, you have exhausted all of those that came after you, Abu Bakr. Right? That Abu Bakr radiallahu anh, while he's Khalifa and has all of these worries and so on, there was a person, there was some houses where a figure would come at night and just come in bringing grain and food and so on and so forth and leave. And it's pitch black, there's no street lamp, so nobody knew who it was and he wasn't looking for attention. So Abu Bakr passed away and this service stopped happening. Right? This person could have appointed anyone to go do this for him. Right? Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anh, this amazing story of the woman mixing the porridge for her children. And Umar ibn al-Khattab was seeing to the needs of people at night. And so he found these children very distressed and upset. And when he inquired, why is this person not caring for these children, not calming these children, she started to complain of Umar radiallahu anh. Right? What was the issue? They had issued a decree that every family with a child that had started eating food, right, and finished breastfeeding, would have an appointed amount from the treasury, but not breastfeeding children, right? And this woman complained of this thing. For that thing, she was rushing this child to stop breastfeeding while he was still young. Now she was speaking to Umar and she did not know that it was Umar, right? Complaining of this person and holding him to this very high status, right? Standard. Umar, there's no reason he would know this was going on. But she considered it part of the obligation to know what the affairs of people were. When he was asked by the people. Obviously, he had people that were assisting him and so on, and went to the grain house that evening and went and to go see to the needs of this person. They asked him, "O Amir al-Mu'mineen, shall we carry it for you or upon you?" He kept insisting, "Upon me." And then remember, Umar ibn al-Khattab is like, what, about over 50 years old at this time in his life, right? He's not a young man, right? Kept insisting, "Upon me," and then he said, "Upon me will you carry my sins for me on the day of judgment." Insisted on carrying the sack to this person and so on and so forth. It's narrated that he actually invited her to his court, to his, place the day, in the days after. And he asked to prepare a contract, to prepare like an agreement by which he would personally compensate her for the madlama, for the wrong that he had inadvertently done to this woman. And it is narrated, in fact, that he asked that this paper be buried with him in his grave. Umar radiallahu anhu said, "I am fearful that if an animal trips in an Iraq, I will be questioned by Allah why I did not level the field." Look at the example of our mother, Khadija bint Khuwaylid, radiallahu anha. Incredibly rich woman, incredibly noble woman. And yet, this incredible human being, right? They had 10 people in their household, married to the Prophet ﷺ 25 years. Among these were Zayd ibn Haritha, right? When he was younger, right? Among them Ali ibn Abi Talib. Among them Fatima, right? Remember, he's raising his cousin, Wafat, taking care of his uncle who raised him when he was an orphan boy, alayhi salatu wasalam. Among them are some of, that all of those that had been in service of the Prophet ﷺ or our mother Khadija were all freed during their lifetime, but none of them wanted to leave. All of them were freed, so they had free status, but none of them wanted to leave this household. So what we forget about this incredible woman, in addition to being a very shrewd and honest businesswoman, in addition to being very noble and high etiquette, even before Islam, Sayyidah Khadija was incredibly respected among people just for her decency before she had been given huda, the guidance of Islam. So this woman, all of these big figures of companions and so on, they looked at her kind of as a mature and role model and motherly figure for the entire community. And she, in that household, were two of the best 4 women to live in history at the same time, right? This woman who had such weight that when her sister would knock at the door, our Prophet ﷺ would become so overjoyed that he would rush to the door, remembering the similarity of the knock and the voice of her sister had, right? I'm mentioning some of these stories because we as human beings, and especially our generation, the younger generation, we mistake activity for organization. We mistake access for power. And we mistake attention for service. Let me say that again. We mistake activity for organization. Sometimes I'm getting a bunch of likes on Facebook, or I'm at this event, or there's a media camera, or there's this, all this activity as part of activism. And I lose sight of the fact that in the long term, I am not effectively affecting change in what I'm working on. That's mistaking activity for organization. Organization is doing the hard, door-to-door, on-the-ground work to build that ability to act, to build redundancy, to not have a person be a single point of failure in a one-stop shop, to eventually be able to affect change. Because we're brought up with so much media, one reason being brought up with so much media and social media and so on, very easy to mistake activity for organization. Mistaking access for power is when a person has a certain opportunity where you see, particularly among political cycles in the United States and even across the world, when a person is giving attention to a Muslim community during an election cycle or whatever, does not mean that that community has enough weight to actually be able to ask for and influence change on hate crime legislation, on issues, on bullying, on immigration, on. And sadly, in the present times, you see that some campaigns have so much to gain by demonizing Islam and Muslims that you can't even get them to look in your direction. But others will come if there's an event, but will not look at you if there isn't something to gain back. That's mistaking access for power. And particularly comfortable, middle class, and immigrant Muslims are very prone to this mistake in America. And what was the third one? Mistaking what? Mistaking attention for service, right? This is a word to myself before you. Be very, very cautious of attending an event on the premise of when can I speak. Be very, very cautious of attending events only when you're in the spotlight. Be very, very cautious of measuring the acceptability or impact of your action based on how many eyeballs landed on it. Our actions or deeds have to be measured by sincerity, by doing our part, and then if you're taking stock to be as effective as possible, no problem. So again, that doesn't mean it's wrong to ever ask to speak. Sometimes you have Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam, when he asked for that, recognized that people were in need and there was no one else to serve it, he said, I know how to do this, and there was no one else. But seeking leadership and authority is very, very frowned upon in Islam. And that's different from stepping up to do a job that nobody's doing. That's different from meeting the call that someone invited you to. Part of the signs of sincerity, and inshallah, one of the things that we hope are indicating a healthy life, is that by nature, you're at some events where you're not speaking. You're just present. You're supporting. Part of the signs, inshallah, of sincerity is that you have a healthy amount of private good deeds, individual things, things that are far from the eyes of human beings. Part of the signs of sincerity is that when the thanks is not there, or when the attention isn't there, or when the appreciation doesn't come, that the deed does not stop. These are all barometers. Understand that these barometers are just indicators. We don't know until we meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But a believer, when they're at the end of a deed, is very, very preoccupied, concerned with the issue of al-qabul, acceptability with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And these are some of the indicators by which a person senses that, corrects course, looks, am I taking the steps towards sincerity, inshallah? Inshallah, the hadith continues, but I know we run out of time. A lot of the hadith is very apparent, inshallah, in meeting, but we'll complete this, inshallah, and continue next time, inshallah.